Thank you very much, everybody, for hosting me, and thank you to Bitcoin Austria and to National Bank. It's really a pleasure to be in Vienna, particularly a pleasure for me, for those of you who've read my book, because I'm extremely influenced by Austrian economists, and that's why I insisted on trying to make this the first stop on my book tour. So, the topic of my book is Bitcoin. And in particular, it's about the idea that Bitcoin is emerging as a new monetary standard. Bitcoin is becoming something like the gold standard. And that's why the title of the book comes from that, the Bitcoin standard, similar to the gold standard. So I'm not going to obviously summarize the entire book, but I'm just going to drop a few of the main ideas that I make in the book so that we can have an open discussion around them. The first concept that I discuss in terms of trying to understand what is it that makes Bitcoin money is to understand what is it that makes anything money. Why does money come around? And there's the first 7 chapters of my book do not even mention Bitcoin almost entirely because they discuss money in general. And we look at the history of money over time, what gets chosen as money, what stops being used as money, why do things go from being used as money to stopping being used as money. And I think, in my opinion, the argument that I make is that the most important factor that determines whether something can be used as money today or in the last couple of thousand years is the fact that it is hard to produce. If something is easy to produce, people use it as money, others will produce more of it, and then the price of it will come crashing down, and then it becomes a useless store of value. If it's hard to produce, people use it as money, they store their value in it, the price goes up, it's hard for others to produce more of it and then bring the price down. So this is why if we look historically, we find that the best forms of money were always the hardest to make. In places where seashells were rare to find, rare seashells were used as money. In places where cattle, initially was used as money because it's hard to make. If we look at limestones or all sorts of things that, in any particular location were used as money, there was always a way, or a physical or a political mechanism of restraining the supply growth. That's really the key point. And whenever we find an example of several forms of money interacting, usually what ends up happening is, or almost always what ends up happening is, what survives as money is whatever is hardest to produce. Because if you have several forms of money interacting with one another, then people who store their money in the money that is easy will lose all of their wealth over time because the money continues to get produced more and more of it, and then the supply of it increases, and so the value drops. So historically, we find that gold became money for this very important reason, which is that the supply growth of gold is the lowest of all the metals because, number one, it's very rare in earth, but even more importantly, gold does not ruin, and because it doesn't ruin, that means that the current supply that we have around the world has been stockpiled over thousands of years. And so even if production were to increase next year, it will only be a small little fractional addition to all the thousands of years of stockpiles that we've piled up. In other words, the potential for the supply of gold to grow as a response to increased demand for gold is the lowest of all other metals. Therefore, it's a hard money. Therefore, gold was the hardest money that humanity had ever had because the supply grows every year at around between 1% and 2%. That's it. No matter what happens to the gold price, the mining output of gold is always around 1 or 2% of stockpiles. And that's what I think makes gold money over many, many years, because nobody could ever guarantee such a low supply growth. Now, if we move and look at government monies, we find the same story. Currencies whose governments prints a lot of them, whose supply increases a lot, they lose their value quickly. And then people move towards the harder currencies whose supply increases less and less. So the main currencies of the world, like the dollar and the euro and the Swiss franc, and the most commonly used around the world, you find that the annual supply growth of these currencies is around 3% per year, 5, 7%, something like that. Whereas, the currencies that are always witnessing crises and inflation, you find that the supply growth there is 10, 20, 30, 50, maybe even much more. And so we have this dynamic over time always, and it's partly due to human psychology that people can recognize that gold is a better store of value than copper, but it's also not just human psychology, it's also natural market selection. It's just people who choose the better money end up with more wealth in the long run. People who choose the worse money end up with less wealth in the long run. Enter Bitcoin. Why is Bitcoin important here? Because Bitcoin has, in the next few years, in about 4 or 5 years, Bitcoin will have the lowest supply growth of anything that has ever been used as money. And it will be reliably lower. Right now, the supply growth of Bitcoin is around 4% per year, which is a little bit more than double of the supply growth rate of gold. But in about 4 or 5 years, it'll drop below that, and then the supply will continue to grow at a lower rate until it stops completely. Why I think this is very important is because this is the reason that Bitcoin won't go away. There are a lot of good reasons, I'm sure many of you have heard, for why Bitcoin is bad. Bitcoin is evil, it consumes a lot of electricity, it's bad for the children, and it's bad for everything. I'm sure you've read the newspapers and you know all the stories. And yet it refuses to go away. Why? In my opinion, because it's very good money. It's very hard money. It's harder money than all the other kinds of monies. And people are just not going to give it up. People might pretend that they will give it up, but people understand that the hardness of it makes it more valuable to hold than currencies that increase every year by 10% in their supply. So if you extrapolate Bitcoin's supply 50 years from now, Bitcoin's supply will grow at about only another extra 20% over the current supply of Bitcoins. Whereas if you extrapolated the euro or the dollar or the yen or any of these currencies over the next 50 years, just by extrapolating what happened over the last 20 or 50 years or whatever, you're going to get several multiples. You know, you're going to get 500%, 600%, 1,000% multiple of the current supply. So thinking of it in the long run, this is an enormously important factor, and I think more and more people are going to wake up to it over time. And you know, the significance of this is that Bitcoin, in my opinion, is not really optional. You know, you can't just say, I don't like Bitcoin, and so I'm just going to keep using my money. There are a couple of stories that I include in my book about societies and what happened to them when a harder form of money entered them. So for instance, West Africa, they did not have manufacturing of glass beads very common. And so glass beads were used as money because they were very hard to make. But then when Western Europeans started traveling down to West Africa and saw that these glass beads were used as money, they would go back to Europe, fill up an entire boat with these glass beads, and then transport it down to West Africa and use it to buy things in West Africa. Eventually, those beads came to be known as the slave beads because it was a way for Europeans to just keep buying everything that the Africans had with them, while the value of the money that the Africans had collapsed. In other words, you know, the Africans couldn't have just said, you know, we don't believe in gold as money and we don't like gold, we prefer glass beads because we've always had glass beads. And because if your money is easy, the people who use harder money, the people who use gold, will find it trivial to make more of your glass beads and then to come and bring them to Africa and use them. And this, I think, is part of the significance of why Bitcoin matters, the hardness of the money. And the fact is that it is also the first strictly scarce liquid asset that we have ever had as human beings. So people talk about scarcity, but I think there's a little bit of a misunderstood element of it. People think in terms of, you know, the quantity of physical metals and resources on Earth is limited, and so everything is scarce. I don't think that's entirely accurate because it's immaterial what the amount of these metals is on Earth. The quantity of iron or copper or gold or oil or anything that we consume as a society is not limited by how much we have on Earth. It's limited by how much time we dedicate to it as opposed to the other needs. In other words, if the demand for copper increases drastically for whatever reason tomorrow, it won't be trivial for us to triple copper production next year and then to keep tripling it for a very long time. It'll be very costly in terms of other goods and services, but it won't be impossible. In other words, the limit on how much copper we have is not in the copper itself, it's in our time. So this, I think, is true of every resource, and I think, and I quote the economist Julian Simon, who's sort of an Austrian, but he's American, and he says, you know, the only real resource, the only scarce resource is human time, because that's the resource that can be used to make more of anything. Nothing else is scarce. Well, now, Julian Simon is not with us, but now we have one more thing that is also scarce like human time, which we cannot make more of no matter what, and that is Bitcoin. I mean, other than that, okay, there are things that we can't make more of. We'll never make another Mona Lisa, we'll never make one of those things, but these things are not liquid. These things are not things that you can use for payment. These things are not divisible and transportable and so on. But Bitcoin is the first liquid asset or resource, if you want, whose supply is truly and scarce, strictly scarce, as I like to call it in my book. And I think the significance of this is that when you understand that time is the only thing that's really scarce for us as human beings, and that money really is an attempt to save our wealth across time, or specifically to preserve the fruits of our labor from today into the future. Money is a technology, essentially, for making the fruits of our labor today available for us for future consumption. Now, you can think of the inflation of the supply of the money as being like an inefficiency in the engine of that technology. Because if you store your wealth in a money whose supply is limited, whose supply is increasing, your wealth is being drained out of that money that you stored it because the money supply is increasing. So now, finally, we have a liquid resource where you can store your wealth wherein nobody can increase the supply. And I think the implications of this are probably enormous. I mean, it means that productive labor can continue to be productive and that its product can remain and gain value into the future. And I think that's going to have very significant effects on how we live our lives, which brings me to the topic of the importance of sound money and the importance of hard money. In chapter 5 of my book, an entire chapter is dedicated to this question, and it's particularly about time preference. Time preference is how much human beings value the future versus the present. And so if you had no choice of saving, if you knew that your only medium of exchange was, let's say, a gas that would evaporate, so you can buy that gas and it will evaporate, you will be very unlikely to save. And if you're unlikely to save, you're unlikely to think of the future. And then all of your decisions as an individual will likely center around the present and around immediate gratification. That's what we call high time preference behavior. As you're able to save, as you're able to think more of the future, you shift your thinking towards the future. That becomes low time preference behavior. And low time preference behavior is really what initiates the process of civilization, as economist Hans Hermann Hoppe likes to say. It's only when human beings begin to think of the future and begin to invest and begin to accumulate capital that we begin to develop the process of civilization, where we start thinking about what is better for the long run and not what is better for our immediate, animalistic needs right now, what we want right now. So I think this is really quite an important thing, and there's this long discussion in my book about the difference in the effect of changing time preference as opposed to the monetary medium. So for instance, if you look at 19th century Europe and you compare it to 20th century Europe, I don't think it's an entirely coincidental thing that, a lot of, say, the way that the music was, the way that the art has changed, the way that architecture has changed, the way that people's orientation, people's savings rates, people used to save a lot more back then than they do right now. And I think there are a lot of evidence to suggest that we're moving more and more towards a high time preference society because of the fact that the money continuously loses its value. Government money is continuously losing its value, which incentivizes people to think of the short term rather than the long term. So I think Bitcoin, the really interesting thing about it for me is that it probably will reverse that process. And those of you who start buying Bitcoin will probably identify with this. Our generation is not a generation that has grown up with a culture of saving. It's not a generation that has grown up with the idea that you keep part of your income. You just spend everything that you have, and when you have major expenses, you borrow, and then you spend the rest of your life in debt. That's high time preference behavior, because you're not saving, because you're continuously thinking about the present, and you're continuously burdening your future self. Now imagine if a society where money gains value every year by 5%. In about 15 years or so, 16 years or so, the value of your money will double. If the money loses value by 5% every year, in 15 years or so, the value of your money will drop by half. Now imagine you've moved from, you were living in either of those. Where are you more likely to save? Where are you more likely to think about the future? Obviously in the one where the money appreciates, because you think about every dollar that you have, this could be $2 in 15 years. Whereas when the money's going down, you think this is $1, it could be $0.50 in 15 years. Why should I keep it in my pocket? It's losing its value quickly. So this, I believe, is one very important implication of having this new monetary medium. Another one, I think, is that it offers us an excellent protection against government abuse, from confiscation of wealth, inflation, and so on. Specifically, Bitcoin as a user technology for individuals. Currently, yes, some people will escape Venezuela with Bitcoin, and that will save their lives. But I think in the long run, the deeper impact that it will have is that it is going to make it harder and harder for governments to finance their operations through inflation. Because citizens everywhere in the world are developing Bitcoin as an exit strategy. So if any government starts inflating its currency, Bitcoin is far more easily available and harder to crack down on than dollars or gold or other currencies. So I think this is going to limit the ability by which government can confiscate wealth. And thirdly, I think the main concept of my book is that how Bitcoin is developing is becoming more and more similar to the gold standard, in the sense that, and those of you who followed Bitcoin might be familiar with the story of Bitcoin scaling and Bitcoin growing. And there's a huge amount of drama about, Bitcoin can only process about 500,000 transactions a day. And that, unless Bitcoin's block sizes are doubled or increased, then it won't be able to grow. And if it doesn't grow, then it won't, if it doesn't have more transactions, then it won't be growing. But if you look over the last year, what has happened as the price of the transaction fees in Bitcoin has gone up, as the demand for Bitcoin transactions went up, yes, it did not kill Bitcoin. On the contrary, what emerged was second layer solutions, where now Bitcoin payments are being settled by Bitcoin payment providers or exchanges or gambling websites or any website that offers Bitcoin as a solution. What they have started to do is to batch all of their transactions with one another into fewer transactions, so that, in fact, today, a majority of transactions done in Bitcoin don't actually register on the blockchain. They're cleared on the blockchain. So for instance, if you and I have an account in an exchange and I want to send you money from my exchange to yours, the exchange won't put the transaction usually on the blockchain so that I will have to pay the full transaction fee. They'll just move it on their own internal record from my Bitcoin account to yours. And then that's it. That's a transaction that has happened, but the Bitcoins are sitting there on their account under their name. And then at the end of every day or every week, they will batch all of their transactions with other exchanges, so that each Bitcoin transaction now is probably standing for 2, 3, maybe 4, maybe even 10 off-chain transactions. And that's exactly what the system was like under the gold standard. Under the gold standard, the actual physical movement of gold happened very rarely. For every ounce of gold that physically moved from one bank or one country to the other, you had thousands of transactions taking place with that 1 ounce, with pieces of paper and bank accounts and so on moving it. So I think the misunderstanding of the scaling of Bitcoin is that it has to happen on-chain, and I think on-chain scaling is completely impractical. Where it's going to be practical is that second and third layer solutions are going to be developed, where Bitcoin is going to be used for settlement. And this is really, I think, in my opinion, where Bitcoin's strength lies. It's not going to replace your Visa or MasterCard payments. It will have the Visa and MasterCard's payment put on top of them. If you compare your Bitcoin payment, it needs at least 10 minutes, it needs about 10 minutes to get one confirmation. In order for you to be sure of it, you need a few confirmations. That's 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes. That's, that's no comparison to your credit card. And it's also no comparison for your credit card, because your credit card is not final settlement. You could still cancel it, and the guy could cancel it, and who knows what might happen. It takes weeks for the credit card payment to finally settle. But it shows up within seconds. So the comparison of Bitcoin payments is not to individual consumer payments. I think the valid comparison is between Bitcoin payments and interbank settlement payments, or between interbank gold settlement payments. And this, I think, is where Bitcoin's strength really lies. Because if you think of it, under the gold standard, the reason the gold standard eventually failed and the reason it eventually was overtaken by government money was the fact that gold clearance is highly centralized. At the end of the day, it's not cheap or easy or safe to move around big chunks of gold from one place to the other. However, if as the size of the economic transactions happening in gold continued to increase, more and more and more people started using second layer transactions, and that necessarily led to the centralization of all gold clearance into a few banks, and then eventually one bank in every country. And then that became very easy for government to take over, and then for government to move forward. So the difference then, and this is the key value addition of Bitcoin, is that it's like gold in that it's a final settlement clearance. It's like gold in that it is very hard money, but it's even harder. But what's even better about it than gold is that you can send it halfway around the world in under an hour for final settlement, for currently around $1 of transaction fees. Even if it goes up to $100,000 of a transaction fee to have a Bitcoin transaction on the Bitcoin network, that's still cheaper than sending large payments of gold halfway around the world, right? So when Germany tried to repatriate its gold from the Federal Reserve a few years ago, it cost a lot of money. So I think what this means is that what Bitcoin is going to offer us is not a new way of buying things cheaper. It's not going to reduce your credit card fees. It's going to offer us a new decentralized central banking system around the world, whereas instead of the current centralized system where we have one central bank for the entire world, I mean, we have several central banks, but let's face it, they all run on the dollar and they all run on the US monetary system. So instead of having one central bank responsible for pretty much all of the clearance of all payments around the world, we'd have thousands of central banks because they can all perform final clearance, because the Bitcoin network, even at current state, even without any improvements whatsoever, can undoubtedly do at least 500,000 transactions a day. So with 500,000 transactions a day, you could have thousands of banks around the world acting as central banks, providing final clearance, and running an entire monetary system independently of the banking system and allowing for payments everywhere around the world without having to rely on the government-run central banking system. It's a viable alternative to central banking, and this is a viable alternative that's only continuing to grow. And the main advantage that it has, which is the reason why people should take it seriously and stop dismissing it, is that it is harder money than anything that we've ever known, and certainly much harder than any of the monies that any of the central banks today are using. I think this is it, and we'll open it up for discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the book. I don't even know where to begin. Let's maybe start. How did you come up with the idea of writing this book? How was the process that led you there? I mean, was there any point in time where you said, well, if I write this book, I'm always going to be the guy who wrote the Bitcoin book, and if it doesn't work out, people will know that I wrote that book?
Actually, I had not thought of that scenario, but I don't think it's not going to work out, let's be honest, because I don't, but who knows? No, I mean, the reason that I decided to write it was just because I'd been following it for so long, and everybody I know was, 2016 and 17, after 3, 4, 5 years of everybody I know laughing at me as, oh, that's the weird Bitcoin guy. 2015, 16, and 17 is when they all started wanting to be